My name is Emily Carter, and when this story began, I was 14 years old. I lived with my parents and four younger brothers in a narrow brick house in the East End of London in the year 1887. People often imagined Victorian England as a place of grand mansions, elegant ladies, and wealthy gentlemen riding through clean streets in fine carriages. But for families like mine, life was very different. Every day was a struggle to find enough food, enough coal, and enough work to survive another week. Our house had only 2 small rooms. My parents slept downstairs beside the fireplace, and the 6 of us children shared the upstairs room. During winter, icy winds slipped through cracks in the walls, and sometimes we woke up to find frost on the inside of the window. We owned very few things. Most of my clothes had belonged to someone else before me. My boots were patched so many times that I could barely remember their original color. My father worked at the docks whenever work was available. Some mornings he left before sunrise and returned with wages in his pocket. Other days he came home, empty-handed because too many men were competing for the same jobs. My mother earned extra money by sewing clothes for wealthier families. She worked until late at night under the weak light of an oil lamp, her fingers often bleeding from the needle. I wanted more than anything to help my family. School was important, but many poor children left school early to earn money. I attended classes when I could, yet I knew that one day I would probably have to work full-time. The law said children should receive an education, but poverty often made different decisions. Every morning I fetched water from a public pump several streets away. There was no running water inside our home. I carried heavy buckets through crowded streets filled with horses, carts, smoke, and mud. The smell was everywhere. Factories released thick clouds into the air, and open drains carried waste through parts of the neighborhood. Disease spread easily. Everyone knew families who had lost children to illnesses that today might seem small. One cold October morning, I was returning from the pump when I noticed a crowd gathering near the factory at the end of our street. Men and women stood silently, their faces full of worry. I recognized several neighbors among them. As I moved closer, I overheard the terrible news. The factory owner had announced layoffs. Dozens of workers would lose their jobs before winter arrived. My heart sank. My father sometimes worked there when the docks were quiet. If he lost that opportunity I did not know how we would survive the coming months. As I hurried home with the buckets shaking in my hands, I could not imagine that this was only the beginning of the hardest year of my life. The moment I entered our house, I knew something was wrong. My father was sitting beside the cold fireplace, even though it was still early in the morning. He usually spent every possible hour looking for work. His shoulders were slumped, and he stared at the floor without speaking. My mother continued sewing, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I carefully placed the buckets of water near the wall and asked what had happened. My father finally looked up and told us the factory would no longer hire temporary workers. Hundreds of men were already searching for jobs, and there was little chance he would find steady work before winter. Silence filled the room. My youngest brother did not understand the news, but the rest of us did. Less work meant less food. Less food meant harder choices. That evening, our supper was thinner than usual. My mother stretched a small pot of vegetable soup so that 6 people could eat from it. Each of us received a piece of stale bread. Meat had become a rare luxury in our home. As I watched my younger brothers eat, I secretly pushed part of my portion toward them. They were still growing, and I could tolerate hunger better than they could. The next morning, my father left before dawn to search for work at the docks. I accompanied my mother to the market district. We hoped to buy vegetables that merchants could no longer sell. Near closing time, prices often dropped because traders preferred earning a few pennies rather than throwing food away. We spent nearly an hour searching through bruised potatoes, wilted cabbage, and damaged carrots. It was not pleasant food, but it was affordable. As we walked home, we passed several children my age entering factories and workshops. Some worked 12 hours a day. Others carried heavy loads through crowded streets. A few girls worked as servants in wealthy homes, cleaning floors, washing clothes, and caring for children. Their lives were difficult, yet many families depended on the wages they earned. I wondered how long it would be before I joined them. Several days later, a letter arrived for my mother from a wealthy client. She had more sewing work available than usual and needed help finishing it before Christmas. My mother's face brightened for the first time in weeks. Then she looked at me. The work required long hours, careful hands, and good eyesight. She quietly asked if I would help her in the evenings. I immediately agreed. At that moment, I believed sewing dresses would be easy compared to carrying water buckets across London. I had no idea how much that decision would change the course of my life. For the next several weeks, my days became longer than ever before. I still attended school when possible, fetched water every morning, helped care for my younger brothers, and now spent every evening sewing beside my mother. The wealthy families who ordered dresses expected perfection. Every stitch had to be straight, every button carefully attached, and every piece of fabric handled with care. We worked under the dim light of an oil lamp until our eyes burned and our backs ached. Sometimes I accidentally pricked my fingers with the needle, leaving tiny drops of blood on my skin. My mother always reminded me to be careful. A single stain on expensive fabric could cost us valuable money. Despite the hard work, I enjoyed earning a few pennies. For the first time, I felt that I was helping keep food on our table. One rainy afternoon, my school teacher asked why I seemed so tired. I wanted to tell her everything, but I simply smiled and said I had been busy at home. Many children in my class faced similar struggles. Some arrived hungry, others missed lessons because they worked in factories or sold newspapers in the streets. Victorian England offered opportunities for some people. But for the poor, every day was a battle against exhaustion. As winter approached, the weather grew colder. Coal became more expensive, and we could rarely afford enough to keep the fire burning all day. At night, we gathered close together, under warm blankets to stay warm. Sometimes I could hear rats moving inside the walls. They were common in our neighborhood, along with fleas and other pests. Nobody liked them, but few families had the means to get rid of them. One evening my father returned home later than usual. His clothes were soaked from the rain, but there was a smile on his face. He had found temporary work unloading cargo ships at the docks. The job would only last a few weeks, but it was enough to bring hope back into our home. That night, my mother used a few extra pennies to buy a small piece of meat for supper. It was the best meal we had eaten in months. For a brief moment, it felt as though our troubles might finally be easing. But the very next morning, as I walked through the crowded market on an errand for my mother, I witnessed something that would stay with me forever. A young boy, no older than 10, collapsed in the street from hunger and exhaustion. The crowd gathered around him, but nobody seemed surprised. In our part of London, such tragedies were becoming far too common. Looking at the pale face of that boy, I realized how close my own family stood to the edge of the same fate. The image of the boy lying motionless on the cold street stayed in my mind for days. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw his pale face and the frightened expressions of the people standing around him. Life in our neighborhood was becoming harder with each passing week. More men searched for work, more families struggled to buy food, and more children disappeared from school because they had to earn money. I knew that my family was surviving, only because every one of us worked as hard as possible. A few days later, my mother received another large sewing order from a wealthy family. Preparing for a Christmas celebration, the amount of fabric that arrived amazed me. Rich people spent more on a single dress than my family could earn in several months. As I carefully stitched lace onto a sleeve, I wondered what it would feel like to live in a house with warm rooms, enough food, and clean water flowing from a tap. Such things seemed impossible to imagine. One evening, while my mother and I worked, my father returned home looking worried. The temporary work at the docks was ending sooner than expected. A shipment had been delayed, and many workers were no longer needed. The little hope we had gained quickly faded. That night, after my brothers had fallen asleep, I overheard my parents speaking quietly. They thought I was asleep as well. My father suggested that I might soon need to leave school and find regular work. My mother's voice trembled as she argued against it. She wanted me to have an education and a better future than she had. But both of them knew the truth. Dreams did not fill empty stomachs. The next morning, I walked to school feeling heavier than usual. During the lesson, I could barely concentrate. Numbers and words blurred together in front of me. When the final bell rang, my teacher asked me to stay behind. She had noticed my struggles and kindly asked if something was wrong at home. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. Instead, I simply admitted that my family was facing difficult times. She nodded with understanding. Before I left, she handed me an old book. It was a collection of stories about young people who overcame hardship. She told me never to stop believing that life could improve. I thanked her and carried the book home under my arm. That evening, after finishing my chores and sewing, I opened the book beside the fading fire. As I read the first pages, I felt something I had not felt in months. Hope. I did not know what the future would bring. But for the first time, I began to believe that my story might someday become different from the lives of so many people around me. The old book from my teacher quickly became my most treasured possession. Every evening, after fetching water, helping my brothers, and finishing hours of sewing, one spent a few precious minutes reading beside the fading fire. The stories described people who had escaped poverty through determination, education, and hard work. Although I knew books could not magically change reality, they helped me imagine a future beyond the narrow streets of the East End. As December approached, London became busier than ever. Wealthy families prepared for Christmas celebrations, while poor families worried about surviving the winter. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, my mother sent me to deliver a finished dress to a large townhouse in a wealthy district. It was the first time I had entered such a neighborhood. The streets were cleaner, the buildings larger, and the air seemed less polluted. When a servant opened the door, I stepped into a world unlike anything I had ever seen. Bright lamps illuminated the entrance hall. Thick carpets covered the floors. The house felt warmer than any place I had ever visited. For a moment, I simply stood there staring. The servant eventually took the package and handed me payment for my mother. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of a girl about my age descending a grand staircase. She wore an elegant dress and carried several books under her arm. Her life seemed completely different from mine, yet we were both 14 years old. The thought stayed with me during the long walk home. That evening, I shared the story with my mother. She listened carefully and then reminded me that wealth did not guarantee happiness. Still, I could not stop wondering how different life might be if my family had been born on the other side of the city. A few days later, a terrible cold swept through our neighborhood. Many people became ill. Coughing echoed through the crowded streets, and several families remained indoors for days. Medical care was expensive, and poor families often relied on home remedies and luck. Soon my youngest brother, Thomas, developed a fever. My mother stayed beside him day and night while my father searched desperately for more work. I tried to help however I could, but fear settled over our home. We had seen too many children die from illnesses that began with nothing more than a cough and a fever. For nearly a week, Thomas grew weaker. Every morning I woke, fearing the worst. Then, slowly, his fever began to break. Color returned to his face, and he asked for food. Relief flooded through our family. It felt like a small miracle, yet the experience reminded me how fragile our lives truly were. In Victorian London, even surviving childhood could never be taken for granted. As Christmas drew nearer, I hoped the worst of our troubles had passed. Unfortunately, another challenge was already approaching, one that would force me to make the most difficult decision of my young life. Christmas arrived, but it was not the joyful celebration many people imagined. In the wealthier parts of London, families gathered around decorated trees, exchanged gifts, and enjoyed large meals. In our home, we were simply grateful to have enough food to get through the holiday. My father had managed to find a few days of work unloading coal barges, and the extra money allowed my mother to prepare a small feast by our standards. We shared bread, potatoes, a little meat, and even a small pudding. My younger brothers were delighted, and for a few hours, laughter returned to our house. Yet beneath the smiles, everyone knew our difficulties had not disappeared. The new year brought colder weather than anyone expected. Snow covered the rooftops, and icy winds swept through the narrow streets. Every morning I woke before sunrise to fetch water from the public pump. The handle was often frozen, and I had to wait with dozens of other people while someone chipped away the ice. The journey home felt longer each day as I carried heavy buckets through the snow. My hands became red and cracked from the cold. One evening, my father gathered the family around the table. His expression was serious. Work at the docks had almost completely vanished. Too many men were competing for too few jobs. He explained that our savings, small as they were, would not last much longer. Then he said the words I had been dreading for months. He believed I should find regular employment. My mother looked down at her hands. She did not argue this time. The silence in the room told me everything. We had reached the point where hope alone was no longer enough. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, instead of going directly to school, I accompanied my father through the city searching for work. We visited workshops, factories, warehouses, and shops. Everywhere we went, long lines of people waited outside the doors. Some employers refused to hire girls. Others already had more workers than they needed. By afternoon, my feet ached, and my optimism was fading. Then we arrived at a textile workshop near the river. The owner needed an assistant to help sort fabric, carry materials, and perform simple sewing tasks. The pay was low, and the hours were long, but it was work. After asking several questions, the owner agreed to let me begin the following week. As we walked home, my father seemed relieved. I tried to feel the same, but sadness filled my chest. Accepting the job meant I would no longer attend school regularly. The future I had imagined while reading my teacher's book suddenly felt much farther away. That evening, I opened the book once more and stared at its pages. The story still inspired me, but now I understood something I had never fully realized before. Sometimes survival came before dreams, and in Victorian London, survival was a full-time occupation. My first day at the textile workshop began before sunrise. The streets were still dark as I walked through the freezing air toward the factory near the river. Smoke already poured from the chimneys, and dozens of workers hurried through the gates. Some were younger than I expected. Several girls appeared no older than 12. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Machines rattled constantly, gears turned endlessly, and workers shouted to be heard over the deafening sound. The air smelled of oil, dust, and damp fabric. The owner introduced me to a supervisor who immediately put me to work. There was little time for conversation. Every minute mattered. My duties included carrying rolls of cloth, sorting materials, cleaning workstations, and assisting experienced seamstresses. The work was far harder than sewing at home. By midday, my arms ached, and my feet felt numb from standing. We received only a short break for lunch. Most workers ate bread or cold potatoes they had brought from home. Some had almost nothing at all. As I sat beside a group of girls my age, I listened to their stories. One had worked in factories since she was 10. Another supported her widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. Their lives were every bit as difficult as my own. During the afternoon, I noticed a young worker accidentally catch part of her sleeve in a machine. Fortunately, another worker reacted quickly and stopped the equipment before serious injury occurred. The incident frightened me. I had heard stories about factory accidents, but seeing one nearly happen made the danger feel real. Many Victorian factories lacked proper safety measures, and injuries were common among workers. When the workday finally ended, darkness had already returned. I walked home exhausted. My entire body hurt, and my hands were covered with small cuts from handling rough fabric. Yet, when I handed my first wages to my mother at the end of the week, I felt a sense of pride. The money was not much, but it helped buy food and coal. For the first time, I truly understood how hard my parents had worked all these years to keep our family alive. Weeks passed, and I slowly adapted to factory life. I missed school terribly. Whenever I passed the building, I thought about my classmates and my teacher. Sometimes I carried the old book with me and read a few pages during lunch. The stories reminded me that my circumstances did not have to define my future. Then one afternoon, while delivering fabric to an office inside the workshop, I noticed something unusual. On a desk near the window sat several newspapers and a stack of handwritten documents. Curious, I glanced at one of the pages and saw advertisements seeking clerks, assistants, and apprentices. As I stared at the words, a new idea began forming in my mind. Perhaps leaving school did not mean giving up on education forever. Perhaps there was still another path, waiting for me somewhere beyond the factory walls. The idea stayed with me for days. Every time I carried fabric through the workshop, I thought about the advertisements I had seen in the office. Clerks, assistants, bookkeepers, and apprentices all needed skills that factory workers rarely had. They needed people who could read, write, and work with numbers. For the first time since leaving school, I felt as though my education might still have value. I began spending every spare moment learning. During lunch breaks, while other workers rested, I opened my teacher's old book. In the evenings, after helping my family, I practiced writing on scraps of paper my mother brought home from sewing clients. Ink was expensive, so I often used tiny pencil stubs that had been discarded by others. One afternoon, the supervisor noticed me reading during my break. I worried she might scold me, but instead she seemed surprised. She asked whether I enjoyed books. When I told her that I had loved school before leaving to work, she nodded thoughtfully. A few days later, she quietly handed me an old newspaper and suggested I practice reading it. It was a small gesture, but it meant a great deal to me. Most people in the factory were too busy worrying about survival to think about education. As winter slowly gave way to spring, conditions in the city improved slightly. More ships arrived at the docks, giving my father occasional work. Food became a little easier to afford, and the worst of the cold weather passed. Yet life remained difficult. Long hours at the workshop left many workers exhausted. Some developed persistent coughs from breathing dust and fibers all day. Others suffered injuries that forced them to leave their jobs. One morning, a girl named Sarah, who worked beside me, failed to arrive. We later learned that she had become seriously ill. Her family could not afford a doctor, and nobody knew when she might return. The news reminded me how quickly circumstances could change. A single illness could destroy everything a poor family depended on. Several weeks later, the workshop owner announced that he needed someone to help organize records and deliveries in the office for a few hours each week. The position would not replace factory work entirely, but it offered slightly better pay and valuable experience. Many workers wanted the opportunity. To my surprise, the supervisor recommended me. She told the owner that I could read well and was eager to learn. My heart raced as he asked me several questions. I answered carefully, hoping not to make a mistake. After a long pause, he agreed to give me a trial period. That evening, I practically ran home through the crowded streets. When I told my parents the news, my mother smiled more brightly than I had seen in months. For the first time since leaving school, it felt as though a small door had opened in front of me. I did not know where it would lead, but I was determined to walk through it. My trial period in the office began the following Monday. At first, I believed the work would be much easier than the factory floor. The room was quieter, cleaner, and warmer. Instead of carrying heavy rolls of fabric, I sorted invoices, copied delivery records, and organized stacks of documents. Yet I quickly discovered that the office brought its own challenges. Every mistake mattered. If I copied a number incorrectly or misplaced an order, the consequences could affect dozens of workers. I worked carefully, checking everything twice, terrified of disappointing the supervisor who had recommended me. Some of the clerks were kind, but others looked down on me because of my background. They knew I had come from the factory floor. A few whispered that a poor dock worker's daughter did not belong in an office. Their comments stung, but I pretended not to hear them. I had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed people's opinions. The hardest part was balancing both jobs. I still spent part of each day helping in the workshop before completing office duties. By the time I returned home, I was exhausted. My eyes often hurt from reading small handwriting under poor lighting, and my fingers cramped from endless writing. Despite this, I continued studying whenever possible. I feared that if I stopped learning, I would lose the opportunity that had finally appeared before me. One rainy evening, as I walked home through crowded streets, a group of older boys began mocking my worn clothes and the books I carried. Education was not respected by everyone in poor neighborhoods. Many believed that people like us were destined to remain poor, no matter how hard we tried. Their laughter followed me down the street. For a moment, doubt filled my mind. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was chasing impossible dreams. When I arrived home, I found my mother mending clothes by the fire. Without saying a word, she noticed my expression and asked what had happened. After listening to my story, she placed a hand on my shoulder and reminded me of something I would never forget. She said that people often mocked what they could not understand. Then she told me that courage was not the absence of fear or doubt. Courage was continuing forward despite them. Her words stayed with me. A few days later, another difficulty emerged. My father injured his back while unloading cargo at the docks. The injury was not life-threatening, but it prevented him from working for several weeks. Once again, much of the responsibility for supporting the family fell on my mother and me. The fear I thought we had escaped returned immediately. As I lay awake that night listening to the sounds of London beyond our window, I realized that poverty was not a single obstacle. It was a series of challenges that never seemed to end. Every time one problem disappeared, another took its place. The question was not whether hardship would come. The question was whether I could continue fighting through it. The weeks after my father's injury were some of the most difficult our family had faced. Although he tried to remain cheerful, I could see the frustration in his eyes. He had always been the strongest person I knew. Yet now even simple movements caused him pain. Without his wages, every penny became important. My mother took on additional sewing work, and I accepted every extra task offered at the workshop and office. Many nights I returned home so exhausted that I fell asleep before finishing supper. Despite the hardship, I refused to give up my office position. The work was teaching me valuable skills. I learned how businesses kept records, organized deliveries, and managed accounts. For the first time, I could imagine a future beyond manual labor. Yet success brought new difficulties. Some workers in the factory began treating me differently. A few believed I thought myself better than them because I spent part of my day in the office. Others were jealous of the opportunity I had received. One woman openly accused me of gaining special treatment. Her words spread quickly through the workshop. Soon, I noticed conversations stopping when I entered a room. The situation hurt more than I expected. These were people I had worked beside for months. I knew their struggles because they were my struggles too. One afternoon, while carrying documents to the office, I overheard two clerks discussing an upcoming examination. A local charitable organization was offering free evening classes for working young people. Those who passed the final examination could qualify for apprenticeships and better positions. The opportunity sounded incredible, but there was a problem. The classes took place across the city after working hours. Attending would mean leaving home before sunrise and returning late at night. I already had little free time and almost no energy. For several days I wrestled with the decision. Part of me feared taking on even more responsibility. Another part knew opportunities like this were rare for someone from my background. Finally, I gathered enough courage to discuss it with my parents. To my surprise, my father immediately encouraged me. He said that while poverty had limited his choices, it did not have to limit mine. My mother worried about my health and safety, but eventually agreed. The following week, I attended my first evening class. The journey alone took nearly an hour. The classroom was small and crowded with young workers from across London. Some were factory employees, others worked in shops, warehouses, or offices. All of us shared the same goal. We wanted something better than the lives we had inherited. The lessons were challenging. After a full day of work, concentrating on mathematics, writing, and bookkeeping felt almost impossible. Many evenings I struggled to keep my eyes open. Yet, with every lesson, I felt my confidence growing. For the first time, I was not simply surviving. I was building towards something. Still, Deep down, I knew that success would require more than determination. Victorian society offered few opportunities for poor girls, and many doors remained firmly closed. The question was whether I could find a way through one of them before life forced me back onto the path I had always known. Spring slowly transformed London. The bitter cold disappeared. Flowers appeared in small gardens, and the streets became busier than ever. For many people, warmer weather meant new opportunities. But it also brought new problems. The city's overcrowded neighborhoods became breeding grounds for disease. Open sewers produced terrible smells, and polluted water continued to threaten thousands of families. One morning, while walking to work, I noticed a crowd gathered around a public notice board. Curious, I stopped to read. The city authorities had issued warnings about a recent outbreak of cholera in several districts. Fear spread quickly through poor neighborhoods, because everyone knew how deadly such diseases could be. My mother immediately became more cautious about the water we collected from the pump. Every bucket had to be boiled before use, even though coal remained expensive. At the same time, my evening classes became increasingly demanding. The final examination was approaching, and many students were struggling. Some dropped out because they could not balance work and study. Others simply needed to earn more money for their families. I often felt close to giving up myself. There were nights when exhaustion made it difficult to focus on even the simplest lessons. One evening, after class, I met a girl named Eleanor. Unlike most students, she came from a middle-class family. Her father owned a small business, and she hoped to become one of the few women working as a professional secretary. At first, I felt uncomfortable speaking with her because our lives seemed so different. Yet we quickly became friends. She shared books with me and helped me improve my handwriting and bookkeeping skills. In return, I told her stories about life in the East End. Was the first time I had formed a friendship with someone from a completely different social class. A few weeks later, an unexpected opportunity arrived. The workshop owner asked me to accompany a delivery clerk to a large textile warehouse on the other side of the city. I had never traveled so far from my neighborhood before. The journey exposed me to parts of London I had only heard about. Grand buildings stood beside elegant parks. Well-dressed families strolled through clean streets. It felt like a different world entirely. Yet even there, signs of inequality remained visible. Servants hurried through back entrances, while laborers unloaded heavy cargo nearby. Wealth and poverty existed side by side throughout the city. On the return journey, our horse-drawn cart became stuck in traffic caused by a political demonstration. Hundreds of workers marched through the streets demanding better wages and safer working conditions. Some carried banners, while others gave passionate speeches. The sight fascinated me. Until then, I had accepted hardship as a normal part of life. Watching ordinary people publicly demand change made me wonder whether society itself could improve. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything I had seen. The city was changing. Opportunities were appearing in places where none had existed before. Yet danger, poverty, and uncertainty remained everywhere. More than ever, I realized that my future would depend not only on hard work, but also on recognizing opportunities when they appeared. And soon, one opportunity would arrive that could alter the course of my life forever. A few weeks after witnessing the workers' demonstration, I received unexpected news at my evening class. The charitable organization announced that the highest-scoring students on the final examination would be invited to compete for several apprenticeship positions in respected London businesses. The announcement filled the classroom with excitement. For many students, including me, such an opportunity could change the course of an entire life. Yet it also brought fear. Hundreds of young people would compete, and only a handful would succeed. From that day forward, I studied harder than ever. I woke before sunrise, worked all day, attended classes in the evening, and reviewed lessons late into the night. Sleep became a luxury. Some mornings I felt so tired that I could barely keep my eyes open. My mother worried constantly and urged me to rest more. But I knew opportunities like this rarely appeared for girls from poor families. One rainy evening, while returning home from class. I took a shortcut through a narrow alley to save time. Suddenly, I heard shouting. Ahead of me, two young boys were running as fast as they could, pursued by a police officer. Within seconds, they disappeared into the darkness. The officer stopped nearby, breathing heavily. He explained that the boys had stolen bread from a bakery. As he walked away, I remained frozen in place. I could not stop thinking about them. In wealthier neighborhoods, stealing was considered a crime. In poorer districts, hunger often drove desperate people to desperate actions. The incident reminded me how fragile the line was between survival and disaster. Several days later, another challenge arrived. The workshop owner announced that business had slowed, and some workers would lose hours. Fear spread quickly through the factory floor. Reduced hours meant reduced wages, and reduced wages meant empty cupboards. Fortunately, my office duties remained secure, but many of my friends were not so lucky. Sarah, who had finally returned after her illness, burst into tears when she learned her hours would be cut. Watching her struggle made me realize how fortunate I had been. Then, just as anxiety seemed to surround everyone, examination day finally arrived. The classroom felt unusually silent. Students sat nervously at their desks while papers were distributed. My hands trembled as I wrote my name at the top of the page. The examination lasted several hours. Questions covered arithmetic, writing, bookkeeping, and reading comprehension. Some sections felt easy, others seemed impossible. When it was over, I left the building feeling completely drained. For the next 2 weeks, all I could do was wait. Every day felt longer than the last. Then one afternoon, as I sorted documents in the office, a letter arrived addressed to me. My heart pounded as I opened the envelope. The results had finally come. What I read inside would determine whether years of struggle had been leading somewhere meaningful, or whether I would remain trapped in the same life I had always known. For several seconds, I could not breathe. My hands trembled as I read the letter again and again to make sure I had understood correctly. I had passed the examination. Not only that, but I had scored highly enough to qualify for the apprenticeship interviews. A wave of relief washed over me. Months of exhaustion, sacrifice, and doubt had not been wasted. Yet my excitement quickly turned into nervousness. Passing the examination was only the first step. The real challenge still lay ahead. That evening, my family celebrated with a simple supper and more smiles than I had seen in years. My father insisted that this achievement belonged to all of us. My mother quietly wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. Even my younger brother seemed proud, though they barely understood what an apprenticeship was. For the first time in a long while, hope filled our tiny home. A week later, I attended my first interview. The office was located in a large commercial building near the center of London. The waiting room was crowded, with young men and women, dressed in their best clothes. Many came from families far wealthier than mine. Some had attended excellent schools. Others spoke confidently about their connections and experience. As I sat there in my carefully repaired dress, insecurity began creeping into my thoughts. What chance did a poor factory worker's daughter really have against candidates like these? When my turn arrived, I entered the interview room with shaking hands. 3 employers sat behind a desk asking questions about bookkeeping, writing, and business records. At first I struggled to find my voice, but gradually my confidence returned. I spoke honestly about my work experience, my studies, and the difficulties I had overcome. The interview lasted nearly half an hour. When it ended, I left unsure whether I had impressed them or failed completely. The following days felt endless. To distract myself, I focused on work. During one office shift, I was sent to deliver documents to a nearby bank. It was my first time entering such a building. Marble floors, polished wood, and elegantly dressed customers surrounded me. While waiting for a clerk, I overheard businessmen discussing investments, railways, and overseas trade. Their world seemed unimaginably distant from the crowded streets where I had grown up. Yet, for the first time, I felt curious rather than intimidated. Perhaps one day, I could belong in places like this. Then another challenge struck. My youngest brother, Thomas, became involved in an accident while playing near a construction site. A falling plank narrowly missed his head but injured his leg. Fortunately, the injury was not severe, but he would be unable to walk properly for several weeks. Once again, our family faced medical expenses we could barely afford. It seemed that every step forward in life was followed by a new obstacle. As I sat beside Thomas that evening, listening to the sounds of London outside our window, I wondered whether success would ever come without hardship attached to it. Little did I know that the answer to that question was already on its way, and it would arrive sooner than I expected. 3 weeks passed before the letter finally arrived. Every day I watched the postman from the workshop window, hoping he would stop at our door. Every evening I returned home, wondering whether my future had already been decided somewhere in an office across the city. The waiting felt almost worse than the examination itself. Then, on a cloudy afternoon, my mother rushed into the workshop, carrying an envelope. I immediately recognized the seal. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. With trembling hands, I opened the letter. For a moment, the words blurred before my eyes. Then I saw the sentence that changed everything. I had been selected for the apprenticeship. I read it 3 times before I truly believed it. The position was with a respected trading company that handled shipments, records, and correspondence throughout Britain. The pay would not be high at first, but it was better than factory wages and offered real opportunities for advancement. Tears filled my eyes. For years I had worked, studied, and sacrificed without knowing whether any of it would matter. Now, for the first time, there was proof that my efforts had meant something. That evening, our tiny home felt brighter than ever. My father smiled more than I had seen in months. My brothers cheered as though I had won a grand prize. Even my mother, usually so practical, allowed herself to dream aloud about a better future. Yet beneath my excitement, I felt something. Elsewhere, the apprenticeship would begin in a different part of London. I would leave behind the workshop where I had spent so many difficult months. I would work alongside educated adults with far more experience than I possessed. What if I failed? What if everyone discovered I did not belong there? My first day arrived sooner than expected. The trading company occupied several floors of a large office building near the river. Clerks moved quickly between desks covered with ledgers, invoices, shipping schedules, and correspondence from around the world. Compared to the factory, everything seemed orderly and precise. Every document mattered. Every mistake could cost money. The pace was relentless. During my first week, I made several small errors. I copied a shipment number incorrectly. I misplaced a record book. I even spilled ink across part of a document. Though none of the mistakes were disastrous, I felt humiliated. Each evening I returned home convinced that I would be dismissed. But instead of firing me, an older clerk named Mr. Whitmore patiently corrected my mistakes and showed me how to improve. He explained that everyone made errors while learning. The important thing was learning from them. His kindness surprised me. Not everyone in Victorian society believed poor girls deserved opportunities, yet here was someone willing to help me succeed. As the weeks passed, my confidence slowly grew. Then one afternoon, while organizing shipping records, I overheard managers discussing an expansion of the company. New positions might soon become available. Listening quietly from my desk, I realized that the apprenticeship was not the end of my journey. It was only the beginning. For the first time in my life, the future seemed larger than the streets where I had grown up. The months that followed passed faster than any period of my life before. Each day brought new responsibilities, new lessons, and new opportunities to prove myself. The apprenticeship was demanding, but I no longer feared every mistake. Instead, I learned from them. My confidence grew with every ledger I completed, every shipment record I organized, and every letter I copied. For the first time, people judged me not by where I was born, but by the quality of my work. Life at home slowly improved as well. My wages increased modestly, allowing us to buy more food and keep coal in the fireplace during the colder months. My father's back gradually healed, and he found steadier work at the docks. My brothers remained in school longer than I had been able to, something that filled me with pride. My mother still accepted sewing work, but no longer had to stay awake until midnight to earn enough money for bread. Our struggles had not disappeared entirely. We were still a working family in Victorian London, and unexpected difficulties could always return. Yet for the first time, survival was no longer our only goal. We could finally think about the future. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after I had left the factory, I found myself walking past the textile workshop where I had once worked. The same smoke rose from the chimneys. The same noise echoed through the walls. Young girls hurried through the gates, carrying bundles of fabric. Looking at them, I remembered the fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty I had felt during those long days. I wished I could tell every one of them that their circumstances did not have to define the rest of their lives. Some opportunities were rare. Some dreams required years of sacrifice, but hope was worth holding on to. As I continued my walk, I passed my old school. Children were leaving for the day, laughing and talking as they hurried home. Through the window, I caught sight of my former teacher. She was older now, but I recognized her immediately. Gathering my courage, I stepped inside and thanked her for the book she had given me years earlier. The same worn book still sat on a shelf in our home. Without it, I might have stopped believing in a better future. She smiled and told me something I would never forget. She said that education is not only about learning facts, it is about learning to see possibilities where others see limitations. As I walked home that evening through the busy streets of London, I thought about how far my journey had taken me. I had begun as a poor girl carrying buckets of water through crowded alleys, uncertain whether my family would have enough food for the next week. Now, although life was far from perfect, I had earned a place in a world that once seemed completely unreachable. The city around me had not changed. The smoke still filled the sky. The factory still roared. Poverty still existed in every corner. But I had changed, and sometimes, that is where every great journey begins. Thank you for spending this evening beside the fire, listening to this story from Victorian England. If you enjoyed this journey through the struggles, hopes, and everyday life of the Victorian era, be sure to subscribe for more cozy historical stories by the fireplace. There will always be another tale waiting in the glow of the firelight.